Welcome to Crossroads. I'm your host, Joshua Philipp. Today we have with us Princess Ingrid, Detter de Frankopan, and she's here to talk to us about the philosophy of law. And so, real pleasure having you on the show.
I'm very glad and honored to be here.
So, why don't we start talking about a bit about your family first, because you are a princess, and people, you know, it's not just a name. You hear it used by new age people these days. She's a real princess. Let's talk about this. Yeah.
Unless there's sort of a red revolution around the corner, you know, then you can lose my head. But otherwise, sometimes it opens doors, sometimes it doesn't. But we come from an old Roman family that had branches all over Europe, but especially in Croatia. So we suffered a bit under communists, where my husband, this is why he grew up in England, and where I met him at Oxford. But the communists, under communists, we were declared enemies of the people, which now is my best title, actually.
Yeah, the real title, the one you wear with honor. Huh?
No, exactly. I have no vocation to be a martyr, but if one can do something with this suffering, which in our case didn't involve much physical suffering, but my husband, when he was 3 years old, spent 2 years in a tent in Egypt, where they had ferried them, and then he came to England. And I mean, it's totally scandalous what communists did.
Now, I understand you just wrote a book about the philosophy of law. Why don't you tell us about it? What's the book title, first off? Then we'll get into it.
The title of the book is Philosophy of the Law of Nations. And that is the work of my life. I have published 17 books, but that is the fruit of all the thoughts I've had since I became a student of law. When I sat there as a young student thinking, you know, the professor says states do this and that. I said, no, they don't, you know, and he seemed to have the wrong explanation of behavior in international society. And it became slightly mysterious to me, and also it's not conducive to promotion if you're a young student to disagree with your professor and say you're actually talking rubbish. So you have to, I believe in speaking the truth and being brave, but there are limits to how you do that. You've got to be a little diplomatic, keep your peace, keep your silence until you are in a position where people might listen to you. So when I became a full professor, I started working on these thoughts I had, that rules in international society are not made by agreements between states written on paper and signed. And I wrote a book then called The Concept of International Law, which in a sense is the skeleton of this philosophy book. And I remember thinking, you know, people can't see it like me. It's a matter of common sense. The soldier doesn't kill babies because it says so in the Geneva Conventions. It doesn't even say it there, but he does it because there's an intrinsic rule in him that this would be wrong. You know, the feeling of how you behave as a human being. And I sort of embroidered on this. I put some flesh on this skeleton from the concept of, if I can mix my metaphors, on this concept of international law, where I had the line which I had come to after many, many years and I disagree with absolutely everyone. I agree with Aristotle, St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, and then, sorry guys, you wasted your life because you're totally wrong here after that.
Interesting. So, thinking about the idea that soldiers have a natural inclination to not commit atrocities unless maybe forced or directed otherwise. But the idea, I mean, generally, but
all human beings
Yeah.
have some moral compass that there are certain things you don't do, and of course there are many who fall off.
Even if they do, some who fall off, but they know it's wrong in their
They
hearts.
know, I'm
at least,
absolutely
yeah.
sure that most people know that's wrong. Of course, people come from different cultures. Like, you know, because we spent some time in Africa, and I know there were some tribes who would kill a baby born with his legs first. You know, I mean, baby come out with the head first. And if he didn't, and that could be because very often there was something wrong with them then, you know, with the baby. But I mean, it seems terrible. But certain cultures had different rules about what is common sense. But most people know have the same values.
And so do you believe then that there is a natural understanding of good that is innate to people?
Precisely.
And maybe this is where common sense comes into play then, that the reason common sense works is because we can, when we speak about values, we can naturally recognize them as being true. Is this accurate?
Exactly. And soldiers in the field is just, they could provide one good example because oddly enough, shockingly, this is not taught in university. They teach land law, tort, contracts, and some very boring subjects, right? And international law is limited to treaties and diplomats and whatever. They do not teach the law of war, which is amazing. And mainly, I think, because we are surrounded by these positivists who think everything's got to be written down on paper, otherwise, you know, sorry, it doesn't really exist.
Yeah. Well, you talked briefly about Aristotle, and I know he mentions in his Ethics this idea that, I mean, as well, he talks about virtue as being kind of the basis of positive direction, but that when actions or policies or cultural phenomena deviate from virtue, that this is almost like something unnatural for people, right?
Well, I would go beyond Aristotle and find something that you find in all the major, say, the philosophers that I respect, and that is, and goes also back to other situations, like I would call the Golden Rule.
Yes.
And the Golden Rule, I think, provides enormous guidance. I avoid the word natural law in my book. I call it intrinsic law, because natural law has been so misunderstood, misinterpreted, especially St. Thomas Aquinas' versions of it, and people very rarely go to the original, but they quote someone else, or they get it from a commentator.
That's true. So sometimes the words we use have been changed to have different meanings over time.
Exactly.
People of different factions, I guess different ideological factions can interpret the same word very differently.
Absolutely.
Natural law is one of those.
Well, I gave you another example with modern slang, at least in England, saying that's absolutely wicked. Meaning something is great, but actually it should be something fairly negative. But I have the major rule, as I see it, and that I set out in my book, is the prohibition of harm. If we respect that as a general rule, of course the soldier will do some harm because he has a mission to win a battle or whatever, but there are rules for how that's done. But there's still some shame, as we perhaps all agree, shooting people in the back, or, you know, in the Middle Ages, of course, he would say, sorry, you lost your sword, sir. Here's your sword, let's start again.
Well, that's true. There was chivalry, there was bushido.
Exactly.
There were different codes of what is right and what's wrong and what is honorable.
But if we comment on the prohibition of harm, we perhaps will realize that from the bottom down, force harm between individuals must be wrong. It must be wrong, unless it's a noble art of boxing, you know, a sport where you have rules how to do this. But otherwise, a prohibition of harm would also cover that, of course, since the environmentalists exaggerate what that means. But of course we mustn't pollute the world. Of course we mustn't throw away plastic bags that take 1 million years to deteriorate and things like that. But that also must be linked with common sense, and also to create an environment where we can all breathe. And this misconception about CO2 is I advised Brazil on the big conference in 1992 on environment and development. And it was embarrassing to hear that they think if you cut down a couple of trees in the Amazon, we won't be able to breathe in London.
Interesting. So you're getting into the idea that law in itself is meant to minimize harm or prevent, stop people from harming others. This is so we can get into guys like, Frederick Bastiat, we talked about in his book, The Law.
Yeah.
The nature of law being meant to prevent, plunder and things like this. But when government can seize control of it and government then becomes the arm of, plunder and things like this, then it becomes evil, right? The law can become something negative.
Absolutely. But the state is us. And the state is, here and there, gradually becoming an enemy if they take control of very much. For example, this idea that you are, in Orwellian terms, supervised everywhere. They know more about me than I know myself. And that's a very unpleasant development. And I'm very much against state control, especially of education.
And so you would say that common sense needs to be an element within the law of minimizing harm.
In everything. And I would put it very simply, law to me is a frame giving the latitude of what is allowed in the state in a country, and what in their privilege of sovereignty they can set out for crimes and of murder and fraud and whatever, what the consequences are. But the rules are, in a sense, most of them are already there. If I combine prohibition of harm with common sense and perhaps with some limitations here and there, what an individual has the right to do. Because, to qualify what is harm, I mean, you have in Aristotelian terms to cater for a situation where we can all live together. So your rights will limit my rights. Freedom will have, you have, for example, one of the most important human rights must be the right of expression. We can say what we want. But you might want to say something I actually don't want to hear, right? And if you think of that in terms of safeguarding children from pornography and other things, you don't want them to, you've got to shelter some, and there got to be some safeguards to provide, to limit the freedom of one in favor of the freedom of another.
And so this is interesting. When you get into the concept of law as something meant to prevent us from, say, trampling on the rights of others, that sometimes law itself can become a factor that tramples on rights.
Absolutely.
And so that balance of limiting law within that boundary of overstepping into the rights of others, that's a very interesting concept.
But on the other hand, if law sometimes a legislator has a duty to protect the weak, but he shouldn't really have to do that if we talk, say, in Christian terms, that it should be instinctive in you not to, who said be nice to the old, to the weak, to the little ones, It wasn't Karl Marx, was it, It was actually Christ. And that is repeated in many religions and philosophies, that this respect for others, something that communists never had. It's me, me, me. No ideology is more egoistic than communism. And if you want to become poor, you become a communist. The whole country will be poor in second. If you want to be poor slowly, you become a socialist because they do have the same goal. And they suppress the freedom of the individual. And the freedom of the individual must be the key to peace. And as I think I mentioned to you, I was advisor to John Paul II, and he said repeatedly, you know, unless you have respect for your own roots, your own sovereignty, the history of your own country, we can never have peace. So this melting pot and globalization, and we're all the same. Of course we're the same if we think of our souls. And many of these people who say these stupid things may go to heaven before me. But you know, it's very dangerous if we are not awake enough to see this creeping erosion of sovereign rights, of individual rights. And I do think I attach enormous importance to the free will of the individual. As I said, as long as your little circle doesn't infringe on other people's little circle.
Great. And I think just the last point is the idea maybe of moral wisdom. Because one thing we've seen in the 20th century, I think, was that, you know, of course, communism, Nazism, you know, socialism, fascism,
yeah.
all of these systems were things that dictated the idea of morals.
Yeah.
They altered the idea of morality, using a very humanistic and materialist theory, one that destroyed traditions in a lot of ways and replaced it with this new kind of centralized government as God ideology.
Yeah.
And, you know, really, I think it's an interesting phenomena that we have the boundaries of moral wisdom, the ability of an individual to decide for themselves based on their traditions, culture, and values,
Yeah.
and religions, of course, what is right and what's wrong, and how it is proper to interact with those around us. Even going back to Aristotle, the idea of virtue, he portrayed virtue and virtuous interaction as a way towards a happier life, that was true joy, right? And even in the Founding Fathers, with the Founding Fathers, the idea of the pursuit of happiness in the classical education sense was rooted in virtue. And so we get into this idea of how government intervention into the realm of morals actually crushes morals and changes the nature of how government needs to regulate the rights of the individual.
Absolutely. And also when they change the morals to make something which to most people is wrong into a right, you know, for example, about abortion, that is suddenly thought to be, it's good to get, not to have sick babies being born, and it's what I think most people got to wake up to realize it is very, very similar to the Nazi selection of who deserves to be born, you know, rather than that the human life and the soul is eternal and individual, and you should not extinguish any life from conception to natural death. And there was a big scandal in England which few people knew about. Doctors put at the foot of a bed in a hospital LPW. It didn't mean much to most people. And it was called the Liverpool Pathway. And that was a euphemism for do not give this patient any water or any food. You can live without food for a month, I think, but you can only live without water for about a week. So within a week, you know, sorry, this person died. And it became, I mean, to me it was a huge, also because it was camouflaged, you know, that it wasn't said openly that, you know, this person doesn't deserve to live anymore, and we decide this, you know. It's to stop suffering. And if there are any suffering, it's usually the relatives or those who wanted to inherit, or, you know, all sorts of other, I mean, it's really a dangerous, slippery road if you think you're in charge of deciding when life begins or ends. And I think that for me as a Christian, as a Catholic, the Annunciation on the 25th of March is when life starts. Christ is not very big at that time, huh? But you know, you can't say that he doesn't exist. And that is the same with a human baby. You know. He exists whether people accept that or not, or whether it's convenient or not, since we're very much on that scale.
Great. Ingrid, it's a real pleasure having you on.
My honor, my
Thank
pleasure.
you.
Very
And
interesting.
where can people find your book?
The philosophy book, I think I'm trying, it was published in London by a Polish think tank, Ordo Juris, but I'm trying to have it republished in this great country, in the United States, where I am at the moment.
Coming soon then.
To have a small version that, with all of it in, not being censored or cut, but small enough for people to carry around, because it's heavy. It's a beautiful production, but it's heavy, too heavy.
Great. Well, coming soon, then we look for it. And
Thank you.
Again, real pleasure having you on.
Thank you.
Great. And everyone, please remember to like and subscribe. See you next time.